Here we go, reading some more of Trouble in Bugland, a collection of Inspector Mantis mysteries. We are up to The Case of the Frightened Scholar. In a little flat on Flea Street, the fire burned low in the fireplace, and a recently used popcorn popper rested on the hearth. In an armchair beside the hearth, Dr. Hopper slept contentedly, hands folded in his lap, bits of popcorn scattered over his vest and trousers. On the other side of the room, Inspector Mantis was engaged in the throwing of some darts. It was a particularly difficult shot, 3 darts held in one hand. He bent his arm, aimed, and threw at the target on the wall. One dart went into the footstool, another went into the back of the sofa, and the third embedded itself in the door, just as a knock came on the other side. "I sincerely hope," said Mantis to himself, quickly gathering up his darts, "that it isn't our landlady. She wouldn't approve of darts in her door, not at all." He shook Hopper awake. "Straighten up your popper, Doctor. It might be Mrs. Inchworm." "Come now, Mantis," said Hopper peevishly. "We live here." "We live here, don't we? Shouldn't a person be allowed to pop a little popcorn without immediately cleaning up? I mean, where's the joy of the thing if one must be constantly cleaning up?" The knock came again, and Mantis hurried toward it. "I'm coming, Mrs. Inchworm." He opened the door with a ceremonious bow. A bedbug was looking back at him, nightcap in hand. "Inspector Mantis." "Indeed, sir," said Mantis, much relieved. "What can we do for you?" The bedbug yawned, twisted his nightcap around in his hand. "I've been sent by my employer." "And who, might I ask, is your employer?" "Professor Channing Booklouse." "And what is Professor Booklouse's problem?" "He shall have to tell you himself." The bedbug blinked sleepily and pointed toward the window and the street below. "I have a carriage waiting." Mantis went to the coat rack and donned his long coat, then hustled Dr. Hopper from his chair. "Come, Doctor, the game is at hand once more." "Oh, rot," said Hopper, clamping on his derby hat and stuffing himself into his coat. As bits of popcorn fell from his vest onto the rug, he was filled with butter and salt and wanted nothing more than to enjoy a quiet evening by the fire. But instead, Mantis was dragging him off to what would undoubtedly prove to be another wild, bizarre, and most likely dangerous night's work. A recently used popcorn popper rested by the hearth. The carriage wheels slowed, then stopped, and the bedbug stepped down, the tail of his nightshirt appearing under his coat. "We're here," he said, and Mantis and Hopper followed to the sidewalk. The street was an ordinary one, of orderly little houses piled so close together the fog could barely creep between them. The bedbug opened a rickety gate and pointed the way across an untended bit of lawn toward a house in which but a single lamp burned. "I see Professor Booklouse has been troubled by prowlers," said Mantis. The bedbug's head turned quickly, but Mantis merely pointed toward the newly installed window guards. The sudden growling of a dog fly from within the house seemed to confirm the supposition, for the bedbug hopped backward at the sound of it. "A new dog," he said, taking out his keys and fumbling with them, as the dog fly continued to make a ferocious racket. "Be careful, he bites," said the bedbug, swinging open the door. "Back! Get back there, you!" The bedbug kicked at the dogfly, and his bedroom slipper flew off. The dogfly withdrew with the slipper in his teeth. Nevertheless, Dr. Hopper gave the beast a wide berth. His trousers were not exactly new, but he could do without some vicious mongrel chewing on them. "This way," said the bedbug. One slipper on and one off, he led them through a dark, musty hallway toward the only room where a light was showing. "Right through here." Professor Booklouse rose to greet them. He was a timid little scholar with spectacles on the end of his nose and papers and books scattered about him. "I'm so grateful for your coming," he said, looking over the tops of his spectacles towards Mantis and Hopper. "Won't you please sit down? May I get you something, a drop of nectar perhaps?" "Your story, sir," said Mantis, seating himself, "will be refreshment enough." Dr. Hopper harumphed. He could have done with a drop of nectar on a wet night like this, but Mantis, confound him, had no concern for anything but the slightest bit comforting once he was on the case. Hopper resigned himself to little in the way of pleasure this night, and sank into a battered old armchair to listen to the tale of Professor Channing Booklouse, who was now pacing, voice trembling as he spoke. I'm a quiet sort, Mr. Mantis, who's never given anyone cause for worry or trouble. I live here with my books and my work. The troubled scholar turned, gesturing toward the walls of his room, which were a solid mass of bookshelves from floor to ceiling. I've nibbled my way through thousands of volumes, digesting what I could of my subject, which is the history of Bugland from its earliest beginnings. Oops. The scholar forced a little smile. It's not a subject everyone would find enjoyable, but to me it's been a life's work. Only now, he gripped the edge of his table, and Dr. Hopper could see that he'd begun to shake all over. Yes, said Mantis. Please go on, Professor Booklouse. Only now my life has been threatened. Booklouse went white. He attempted to push his spectacles up on his nose, but his trembling hand could barely find the rims. Oh dear, if only I hadn't come upon that book. What book, Professor Booklouse? Mantis leaned forward, speaking softly. The book that caused all this trouble. Booklouse flopped down at his desk and put his head in his hands. His assistant, the bedbug, spoke from the corner of the room in a reclining chair. Both his slippers were now off, and his nightcap was down over his eyes. His voice came in a sleepy whisper. Professor Booklouse found a book quite by accident. The trembling professor raised his head from his desk, knocking against a hanging lamp which danced, casting moving shadows on the wall that seemed to tell a story of their own, of fright and capture. Yes, quite by accident. I came upon it stuffed in a flower box in a gypsy moth tea room, and not far from here. Are you familiar with it? I'm afraid not. It's a pleasant little place with a delicious menu. I usually eat a few pages when I go there. The glue on the menu is, I might say, outstanding. Mantis sighed in his chair, waiting for a more useful fact to emerge from Booklouse's nervous narrative. Well, on this particular day, continued the professor, I was on my way out of the tea room feeling quite stuffed. He smiled sheepishly. You see, I'd eaten the entire dessert page. Get on with it, Booklouse, if you would, please. Yes, of course, forgive me. I was going out the door when I noticed something concealed in one of the flower boxes. I withdrew it, and much to my surprise found it to be an early illustrated history of Bugland. I took it home, and that evening I devoured its contents. There, on the edge of my desk, is all that remains of it. Mantis reached for the volume, which consisted now of only the front and back cover. Professor Booklouse spoke again. It was a tasty little work, and I considered myself very lucky to have found it until... Here Booklouse broke off, his body beginning to tremble again, and his spectacles slipped down his nose once more. Yes, Professor, said Mantis. Please continue. Well, said Booklouse, trying to control his emotions, soon after I digested it, I realized that it had been more than just a history of Bugland. And how was that? I began to have the strangest information at my fingertips, not about the history of Bugland, but instead... The timorous scholar seemed to pale to his roots. He looked quickly toward his barred window, then back toward his guests, as his voice went low. Instead, I had somehow thoroughly digested the most secret information about the highest workings in the Admiralty. Dr. Hopper sat straight up and looked directly at Mantis. This is most serious. Indeed it is, said Mantis, again opening the covers of the devoured book. You say you ate every page of it. To the last scrap, said Booklouse. It was, after all, my special subject, or so I thought, until you began to have certain knowledge of naval matters. Naval, yes, and of the secret affairs of the embassy. Professor Booklouse stood, knocking his head on the lamp again, setting it swinging once more. From the corner of the room, low snores broke forth from the bedbug. Mantis stared thoughtfully at the remains of the illustrated history as the lamp swung back and forth above it. Obviously the book was coded. Yes, examined the scholar, and whoever coded it was a spy, and that spy now means to take my life. Or wants his book back. But I've eaten it, cried the terrified professor. He gestured once again toward his library shelves, as I have eaten every other volume I own. There are the empty covers. The contents have all been chewed over thoroughly, night in and night out, until nothing is left. My research has been complete, including the volume you hold in your hand, which I wish I'd never seen. Oh dear, oh dear. Have you contacted anyone in our government since this happened? No, I've been afraid to do anything except contact you. I suggest you maintain that position for now and leave matters in our hands, Dr. Hopper. If you'd care to join me, I'm going to have a look around the garden. Mantis stood and with Dr. Hopper proceeded out through the hall and onto the porch. The inspector's glance went quickly over things there and he stepped into the garden where his curiosity seemed to be satisfied just as quickly. A final step took him out into the street where he bent for a moment over some faint impressions of a wheel left in the mud. There's nothing for us here, Doctor, he said, straightening up. As might be expected, a spy is not likely to leave clear traces. We can only say he is long-legged, walks with a slight crouch, and has one boot worn down slightly at the heel. Not much to go on, really. Blast you, Mantis! How did you know that much? Hopper stared around the unkempt garden and the street, which revealed nothing to his searching eyes. Mantis ignored the question, his mind already jumping forward to the next square. Doctor, does my memory serve me correctly? Was not the Duchess of Doodlebug once a patient of yours? I treated her for lumbago. Then you must prevail upon her to get us an invitation to the next embassy ball. The music was grand, the gathering fancy, and Dr. Hopper was faintly embarrassed by it all, especially with the Duchess of Doodlebug introducing him to everyone. It might be to some people's taste, but all the chandeliers and polished floors and glittering tables, but he'd soon be in front of his own fireplace with the old popper going and nothing to do but listen to rain on the roof. Oh, Doctor, you must meet Ambassador Cornbore. Ambassador, this is Dr. Hopper, who cured my lumbago. How do you do? Said Cornbore. I say, would you mind having a look in my ear? Whenever I meet a medical man, I like his opinion. Do you see anything in there? I have an unobstructed view, Hopper excused himself and took refuge behind a large potted plant. Through the leaves he could watch things and not have to meet any more bores like Cornbore. The Duchess of Doodlebug, he noticed, had now collared Mantis and was towing him around. Hopper was happy to see Mantis's discomfort. Serves the fellow right for dragging us here. But of course there is a higher purpose. We've come to find a spy, long-legged, walking with a crouch. But no such figure was in sight. He has to be a clever sort, reflected Hopper, and he has to have an accomplice somewhere in Bugland, an enemy agent who would have picked up the coded history of Bugland had not Professor Channing Booklouse found it first and devoured it. Oh, Dr. Hopper, there you are. The Duchess of Doodlebug caught him off guard from behind. Ah, yes, Duchess. I was just studying the foliage of this remarkable plant. You must come along, Doctor, and be introduced to Baron Blowfly. What an infernal nuisance, thought Hopper. But then he saw that Baron Blowfly was long-legged and walked with a crouch. A prime suspect. Hopper quickly looked toward the Baron's boot heel, but could discern nothing beyond the Baron's bright spurs. Nonetheless, thought Hopper, one must be thorough. How d'ye do? He said, still trying to catch a glimpse of the worn boot heel. And what, asked the Baron with a withering stare, are you looking at? I was noticing your handsome spurs. Are you fond of riding? The Baron's eyebrow raised. He seemed to regard Dr. Hopper as one who'd gone mad. I'm always curious about a person's footwear, said Hopper, tilting a little to the side. Show me a person's footwear and I shall tell them what they ate for breakfast. The Baron stared coldly at him. What did you say your name was? Hopper. I'm the Duchess of Doodlebug's medical adviser. And what have you advised her of lately? of the importance of proper diet. Lots of popcorn, the perfect food. Popcorn? Exclaimed the Baron. Surely you're not serious. Never heard of the glorious attributes? Hopper looked up at the Baron. Why, I was reading of its importance only the other day in the Illustrated History of Bugland. Hopper squinted, looking for the slightest trace of reaction from Blowfly, but the Baron, flinching not an eyelash, leaned in over the doctor and repeated loudly in disbelief, Popcorn? He turned on his boot heels and walked away. Hopper hopped after him, bending down to look for the telltale edge of a worn heel, when he was tapped gently on the back. Did you drop something, Doctor? He leapt up, ready to defend himself against the Duchess once more, but instead it was Mantis towering above him. Mantis, I was about to confirm a boot heel. Blowfly's not our spy. Are you certain of it? His height is a centimetre over that of the individual who left his print in Professor Booklouse's garden. Well, said Hopper, have we found anything then? We found the leak, said Mantis. The Lord of the Admiralty is over there. Hopper looked toward a jovial old ruffian dipping a cup into the nectar bowl. Yes, what about him? Admiral Waterstrider is inclined to indulge himself in the heavenly beverage to the point of indiscretion. Whatever leaks there are in his navy, the Admiral himself has drilled. But with whom? Mantis was about to speak when a shrill voice bore down upon them. Oh, Doctor, exclaimed the Duchess of Doodlebug, you must meet my daughter. I'm afraid we haven't time. Hopper swallowed his words as the most beautiful creature he'd ever seen suddenly appeared from behind the Duchess. The creature smiled and held out her hand. I'm happy to meet you. Dr. Hopper bowed over her fingertips. The pleasure is all mine, he said, and looked up into her charming face. How intelligent she seemed, how poised, confident and graceful, how... Forgive us, said Mantis, stepping in beside his companion, but we have urgent business we must attend to. The Duchess of Doodlebug snapped her fan at them. But the evening has just begun. One of you must dance with Laura. Mother, if the gentleman must leave, Doodlebug's eyes lingered on Dr. Hopper, and he seemed to read in them an invitation to join her at the nectar bowl. Blast Mantis and his urgent business. Then, said Mantis, pulling at the doctor's coattails, since you are so kind to us as to excuse us, we shall withdraw. They turned, Mantis urging the doctor toward the door, but Hopper turned back in time to see Baron Blowfly bowing to Laura Doodlebug and escorting her onto the dance floor. Dash it all, Mantis, growled Hopper, you might have given me 2 moments with the young lady. There is another chase awaits us, Doctor, in service of the Admiralty. Hang the Admiralty, said Hopper. I was staring into the prettiest eyes in the room. Later, Doctor, on some quiet afternoon you may take Miss Doodlebug on your arm, but this night holds an adventure which won't wait. The banded footman bugs bowed at the embassy door, and Hopper and Mantis stepped out into the echoing stone courtyard. As they passed between the gathered carriages, Mantis casually pointed to one of them. Interesting, Doctor. How wheels tell their own story, exactly as do boot heels. He touched the scarred edge of the wheel. This mark perfectly matches that left in the mud on the street where Professor Booklouse lives. Why, then we have our spy. This is an embassy carriage, Doctor. It is used by a number of different officials. Well, we've only to watch for each of them until we see the long-legged crouching chap. His name is Golgnat, Doctor, and he has already flown the net. But how do we know this fellow Golgnat is the spy? Asked Hopper. They were crossing a footbridge above a small canal, their voices falling away into the fog that rolled along the water. While you were waltzing with the Duchess, Doctor, I was in the embassy offices making certain measurements. The floor beneath Golgnat's desk bears traces of a worn boot heel, though through which a nail protrudes, enough to make small, distinctive scratches, such as I found on Professor Booklouse's front porch. Moreover, the arrangement of his lamp and chair indicated a tall man crouching at his desk. This habitual warp evidenced in the professor's garden, where the bushes had been only slightly parted overhead. though the length and depth of the footprint within them remained the same as on clearer ground. Only someone with a natural crouch could leave such a track. Mantis, you astound me. Nonsense. The fact remains, Gornat has fled. And are we following him? This fog is so thick, I don't know where I am anymore. We are intercepting him, Doctor, at his next rendezvous, which is, I cannot say for certain. His singular boot heel indicated the direction we now travel in. For the rest of it, I must try and detect him with these. Mantis touched his slender antenna slightly and worked them back and forth in the air. Difficult, he muttered to himself. Most difficult. Hopper's own antennae switched and searched, but a million signals crossed the night, making an immense scramble of pulsations. Mantis walked on, still muttering to himself as his feelers moved left, right, left again. A few longitudinal veins, single cross vein, medial unbranched fold. Hopper shook his head in wonder. Mantis had the signal, his figure concentrating itself in a way familiar to the Doctor. They'd be tracking now, to the bowels of the earth if need be, with no stopping for rest, nor for water should they find themselves dying of thirst in a desert. Mantis was unbalanced that way, a regular fiend for the chase. A mad dog, actually. Once he got the scent, well, sighed Hopper, I'll get no sleep tonight. Mantis led on through a narrow cobble street that twisted and turned between century-old houses and then spilled out into a great open thoroughfare, which they crossed, only to plunge once more into a back alley time had forgotten. The footing was muddy, the lighting primitive, feeble flickering lamps doing little to penetrate the heavy mist, but Mantis tracked, his body hunched over, his head forward, until he himself must look like his long-legged crouching prey, the traitorous Gornat. Suddenly, Hopper's own antennae twitched again. He paused. He swept them across the million-fold network of the night. Somewhere near, in the fog, was a popcorn wagon. I say, Mantis! But the inspector was already turning down a dark, dank passageway between two factory buildings, and the lovely popping signal faded. Hopper shuffled along in pursuit of his now swiftly moving companion. There! Mantis pointed to the track of a boot heel, worn slightly, with the outline of a nail head in the corner. The inspector knelt, examining the boot heel. Curses, Hopper! This track is 2 hours old. But how can you tell? The toe has filled with water. The edges of the sole have crumbled. He's out beyond us again. Well, let us give chase. A moment, Doctor, for something tells me, Mantis pointed to the shadows, his voice dropping. Quickly, we must hide ourselves. Hopper leapt into a barrel, drawing the lid over his head. Through the plug hole he had a view of the factory yard. He scanned the terrain for a sign of Mantis, but the inspector had melted into the shadows to wait for someone or something. Well, thought Hopper, I'm comfortable enough if sitting in an inch of water is anyone's idea of comfort. Hungry too. Racing about for hours like this with nothing in the old bread basket. But didn't I? Let me see here. Oh yes, I did. From the watch pocket of his vest he'd withdrew a small box of raisins, which he'd completely forgotten in the heat of the chase. Ah, what a godsend! Delicious, delicious. Now, if I just had a good book to read. He leaned back in the barrel, trying to arrange his holding position a bit, but something was sticking him between the shoulder blades. He reached behind and found, much to his surprise, a book wrapped in a waterproof bag and attached to the side of the barrel. Most peculiar. Book in a barrel. Never heard of such a thing. He held it up to the plug hole through which the moonlight was shining. Illustrated History of Bugland, Volume 2. Good heavens! This is Gornat's work, to be sure. I must tell Mantis at once. The Doctor attempted to straighten himself, but as he did so, a footstep sounded at the other end of the passage, and he sank back down to the bottom of the barrel. The footsteps came nearer. He steeled himself for a struggle, but the footsteps moved slowly past the barrel into the factory yard. There, in the dim light, he caught sight of their quarry. The figure turned, checking to make sure he was alone, and Hopper saw, not Gornat, but the even more unpleasant face of a hair-chewing chicken louse. The accomplice, thought Hopper, come to pick up another coded message which lies hidden in this barrel. The chicken louse, feeling certain he was unwatched, made for the barrel. He lifted the lid, put his hand down inside, and came up with Hopper's hat. "Good evening," said Hopper, coming up after it. The chicken louse jumped back into the arms of Mantis. "Thank you, Mr. Chicken Louse, that will do." Mantis held the struggling enemy agent with an unbreakable grip. Who are you?" "Servants, Mr. Chicken Louse, of the crown you sought to crumble." The hair-chewing Chicken Louse continued the struggle as Mantis led him up the passageway. The illustrated history of Bugland Volume 2 was in the doctor's hands, and he noticed that under certain letters tiny pinholes had been made. By moving from letter to letter, he began to read a message quite different from the one intended by the author of the book. "I say, Mantis, I found the coded part." "Yes," said Mantis, "and now we must find the chap who wrote it. But first," he signalled for a cab that was passing on the lonely road, "let us deposit this fine fellow with the authorities." "You'll prove nothing," snarled their captive. We'll attempt to prove everything, Mr. Chicken Louse," said Mantis, opening the carriage door and lifting the hair-chewing enemy agent up to the seat. "Golnat will no doubt be in disguise." Mantis entered the railway waiting room, Hopper beside him, each of them carrying a piece of luggage in the style of ordinary travellers. "But how do you know it's a train he'll be taking?" asked Hopper. "While we were trailing him to the factory, Doctor, I kept receiving the images of flashing trees, hills, houses, the view one would have from a racing train. He was obviously thinking about what his next step would be." "Gad, Mantis, you have the most sensitive pair of feelers in Bugland." "It is practice which has altered their scope, Doctor. You might do the same if you were inclined to locate something other than a popcorn wagon." "Here now, Mantis, there's no need to be insulting." "Only joking, Doctor. Please forgive me." Mantis smiled. "You are an indispensable ally." Hopper harumphed with embarrassment, and now, of course, it would be impossible to open the little zipper on his bag and have a handful of emergency popcorn he'd packed in there, for Mantis would take the opportunity to chide him further. "Seat yourself, Doctor, though I think our wait will be a brief one." Mantis dropped onto the bench and tilted his head backwards slightly so that his delicate feelers were lifted at an angle. There is a strong nervous excitement in the air, much greater than an ordinary passenger would create. He closed his eyes and spoke softly, his voice almost a whisper now. "What I feel is the fear of a fleeing spy." When he seemed to sleep, as other of the waiting passengers on the benches were doing, and Hopper took the opportunity to quietly unzip his bag and take out a handful of the pink stuff. Excellent. Still quite crisp. The faintly audible munching sounds he made caused the trace of a smile to cross Mantis's lips. "But devil take him through," thought the doctor. "I'm hungry." However, before he had time for another handful of popcorn, his eyes were drawn to the door, where a tall, crouching figure had entered, weighed down by a large bag, his face almost completely masked by a scarf worn high on his neck. Hopper turned to Mantis, who appeared to have fallen into the deepest sort of sleep. "Well," thought Hopper, "I will simply bring this case to a conclusion myself, and won't Mantis be a little red-faced for having passed out on the job?" Hopper stood, and taking a stout grip on his cane, walked over to the tall, crouching passenger who had placed himself at the ticket window. Hopper got in behind the man and said quietly, "It's all up with you, Golnat. If you attempt to struggle, I'll thrash you within an inch of your life." The figure turned slowly, the scarf dropped slightly, the eye that riveted Dr. Hopper was cold, and the voice caustic. Well, if it isn't Dr. Popcorn." The doctor stepped back, shocked. "Ah, excuse me, Baron Blowfly, I mistook you for a popcorn salesman." The Baron fixed his scarf, purchased his ticket, and stalked away, leaving Dr. Hopper standing in confusion at the station door. But a shout from Mantis echoed behind him, and Hopper turned in time to see the inspector moving after another figure across the waiting room and out onto the platform. Hopper took the room in 2 fast hops and plunged through the station door. Mantis was already on the tracks, pursuing a tall, crouching Golnat, whose cape floated on the air as he scrambled to the opposite platform. "Halt!" cried Hopper, and joined the chase. Over the gleaming rails, Mantis, in one leap, was on the inbound platform. The spy raced through the station doorway, and Mantis raced after him, diving at his boot heels and tripping him up. They tumbled together across the waiting room floor, the spy drawing a jewelled dagger. He slashed at Mantis, who caught the thrust with his wrist, twisted the knife from Golnat's hand and pinned him to the floor. "Cease struggling, Adrian Golnat, or I shall break all 4 of your arms." Dr. Hopper closed in, along with the station policeman and a crowd of passengers who approached cautiously. "All right now," said the policeman. "What's going on here?" "I'm Adrian C. Golnat," said Mantis's imprisoned prey, "attached to His Majesty's embassy, and this ruffian—" "I am Inspector Mantis, and this is the end of your game, Mr. Golnat. Officer, there is overwhelming proof of espionage. I suggest you escort Mr. Golnat to the nearest station house." "Very good, Inspector," said the policeman. "Come along, you." The struggling Golnat was led off, and Inspector Mantis straightened his cap. "I noticed you in conversation with Baron Blowfly, Doctor. Is he well?" Dr. Hopper sat by an early afternoon fire, working on his scrapbook, to which he now added the brief newspaper account of the capture of Adrian Golnat and his accomplice, the hair-chewing chicken louse. At the other side of the room, Inspector Mantis was digging a dart out of the wall. A knock at the door caused them both to look up, and it was Hopper who opened it while Mantis hid his darts behind his back. "A letter for you, Doctor," said Mrs. Inchworm, pressing it to the doctor's hand. "And such fancy stationery, too." "Thank you, Mrs. Inchworm. It was kind of you to bring it." The doctor gently closed the door against the landlady's curious gaze and carried the letter over to his chair by the fire. "Good news, Doctor?" asked Mantis, seeing the delighted expression on the doctor's face as he held the envelope up to the light, turning it this way and that. "It's from the Duchess of Doodlebug," said Hopper brightly. "I wonder what it could be in it." "Some people find opening a letter to be the solution to that problem," said Mantis, leaning over the edge of Hopper's chair. "Ah, you're curious, Mantis. Admit it. Admit that you're burning with curiosity and envious as the devil of what you know is in here. An invitation to call at the Doodlebug residence for tea with Miss Laura Doodlebug. Are you expecting such a summons?" "Why, of course. Just this Monday I sent my card around suggesting I'd be free for the next several weekends." "Then you have received the answer to your prayers," said Mantis, feigning a renewed interest in his darts, while Hopper tore open the envelope. There was a long silence in the room, broken only by the crackling of the fire. When Mantis turned, it was to note that the envelope and its contents were in the fire, edges curling with smoke. "I see it is a formal announcement, Doctor," said Mantis, as the flames licked through the engraved lettering. "Indeed," said Hopper morosely. "Announcement of what?" "Of the engagement of Laura Doodlebug to Baron Blowfly, that's what." Oh no. Mantis went to the cupboard and brought down a bag of small golden kernels and the popper. "You'd better have some of this, old boy. You look rather done in." "Thank you," said Hopper, accepting the popper. "Most kind of you." "Don't mention it," said Mantis. The two friends sat before the fire, watching the flames and listening to the bright popping sound of the popper as the light afternoon rain began to fall outside on Flea Street.